Something extraordinary is happening inside the world's biggest computer companies right now, and almost nobody outside the industry is talking about it the way they should be. Lenovo, HP, Dell, Asus, the exact same names that have shipped Windows on every laptop you have ever owned, are quietly pulling back from Microsoft's operating system. Not abandoning it completely, not yet, but distancing themselves from it in ways that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. And once you understand why, you will never look at your next laptop purchase the same way again. So let me ask you something first. When was the last time you actually chose Windows? Not used it because it happened to be sitting there when you opened the box, but genuinely evaluated it against something else and decided it was the better option. For almost everyone watching this, the honest answer is that it never happened. Windows was simply installed before you ever touched the machine. That is not an accident. That is one of the most effective distribution strategies ever built in the software industry. And right now, in 2026, that strategy is showing real cracks for the first time in 3 decades. Here's what changed everything. Every single laptop that ships with Windows costs the manufacturer a licensing fee, and industry estimates place that figure somewhere between $50 and $80 per unit, depending on volume and configuration. On paper, that might sound manageable. In reality, it is brutal, because the average profit margin on a consumer laptop sits in the range of 4 to 6%. On a $400 machine, that leaves the manufacturer with maybe $16 to $24 of actual profit once manufacturing, shipping, retail placement, and marketing are all accounted for. Before any of that math even gets started, a huge chunk of the remaining margin is already gone straight to Microsoft. Multiply that across tens of millions of units a year, and you begin to understand why manufacturers have started quietly asking a question they never used to ask. Is Windows actually worth what it costs us anymore? Reports circulating through hardware forums and confirmed by multiple trade outlets this year describe HP running an extensive internal trial through 2025, testing Linux as a genuine alternative operating system across its laptop lineup, with Windows shifting from the automatic default to an optional extra that customers now have to specifically request and pay more for. Dell and Asus have reportedly been running similar evaluations of their own, offering Linux configurations alongside Windows and watching closely to see what customers actually prefer when given a real choice. The reasoning being cited internally lines up almost perfectly with the math I just walked you through. Microsoft charges a royalty on every single Windows installation, while Linux carries no licensing fee whatsoever. On top of that, Windows increasingly demands newer, more expensive hardware, components just to run properly, while Linux runs comfortably on a much wider range of chips and configurations, cutting manufacturing costs even further. Now, layer onto that the timing of one of the most disruptive deadlines in the history of consumer computing. Windows 10 officially lost free mainstream support in October of 2025, and even with a temporary 1 year. Extended security update bridge that a huge number of users quietly enrolled in, that safety net is scheduled to run out completely in October of 2026, with absolutely no second extension coming after that. And here is the part that should genuinely alarm you if you are still running an older machine. Even now, months after that original cutoff, industry reporting indicates that roughly half of all personal computers worldwide are still running Windows 10, many of them owned by small and medium-sized businesses that simply have not made the jump yet. HP's own chief executive acknowledged on an earnings call this year that the pace of upgrades has been slower than in any previous transition, admitting openly that a large portion of customers are not convinced the benefits of switching justify the cost or disruption. Think about what that actually means. Millions of machines that work perfectly fine, that handle email, browsers, spreadsheets, and video calls without a single complaint, are now technically unsupported, and a huge share of those machines do not even meet the hardware requirements Microsoft demands for Windows 11. Things like a TPM 2.0 security chip and a specific generation of processor. Perfectly good computers suddenly told they do not qualify. And when people are told that the machine sitting in front of them, the one that has never given them a problem, is now obsolete simply because a corporation moved the goalposts, loyalty does not increase. It quietly starts to erode. That erosion is exactly the opening that Linux distributions and independent hardware makers have spent the last 2 years preparing for. And in the next section, I'm going to walk you through exactly how deep that shift has already gone, including what one volunteer coalition of major Linux projects has built specifically to catch users falling off the Windows 10 cliff, and why Valve's gaming platform just posted numbers that nobody expected this early. Because while Microsoft's own deadline was pushing users toward the exit, a coordinated response was already being built by the open source community, and it was more organized than anything Linux advocates have managed in the platform's entire history. A volunteer campaign backed by major projects including Debian, Fedora, GNOME, KDE, and Zorin spent The past year, quietly constructing exactly the kind of off-ramp that Microsoft has no incentive to ever mention to you. Zorn OS alone reported that more than 780,000 Windows users switched over around the end of support deadline, a number that would have sounded impossible just a few years ago for a desktop Linux distribution aimed at everyday consumers rather than developers. And this was not some scrappy underground movement operating out of forums. Hardware companies started showing up with real, purchasable products built specifically for this moment. Framework, the modular laptop maker, known for letting owners repair and upgrade their own machines rather than throw them away, revealed that it is now selling more units with Linux pre-installed than with Windows, according to the company's own published numbers. Think about that for a second. A laptop manufacturer is telling you directly that Linux has become the more popular choice on at least part of its lineup. That is not a hypothetical anymore. That is a company stating a commercial fact. Lenovo's ThinkPad line, long considered the gold standard for business laptops, has become one of the most recommended machines for Linux compatibility across technology publications this year, alongside newer entrants like the Dell Pro Max lineup, which now ships with factory-installed Ubuntu and full enterprise support behind it. Dell's XPS Developer Edition, System 76's Lemur Pro, and a growing list of budget-friendly options like Lenovo's IdeaPad Slim series have turned what used to be a niche hobbyist activity into something you can walk into buying with full manufacturer backing, complete driver support, and firmware updates delivered through infrastructure called the Linux Vendor Firmware Service, which lets you patch your hardware's low-level security vulnerabilities without ever needing to boot into Windows at all. And then there is gaming, which for decades was the single strongest argument keeping people locked to Windows no matter how frustrated they got with everything else. That wall is coming down faster than almost anyone predicted. Valve's compatibility layer, known as Proton, has expanded the playable Linux game. Library from around 9,000 native titles to roughly 106,000 playable games, a 12 times increase, with independent tracking site ProtonDB confirming that close to 90% of all Windows titles now launch successfully on Linux, and more than 40% of brand new releases earning top-tier platinum compatibility ratings almost immediately. Then came March of 2026, and the number that genuinely stunned people who track this data professionally. Valve's own hardware survey showed Linux crossing 5% of Steam's entire user base for the very first time in the platform's history, jumping over 2 full percentage points in a single month, the largest one-month gain Linux gaming has ever recorded. Applied against Steam's roughly 132 million monthly active users, that translates into somewhere around 7 million people now gaming on Linux every single month. A huge driver of that surge is Valve's own Steam Deck handheld, which registers as a Linux machine in every single survey response, regardless of whether the owner even realizes what operating system is running underneath the games they are playing. With an estimated 5.6 million units shipped and roughly 48% of the entire handheld gaming PC market under its control, the Steam Deck has quietly normalized Linux for millions of people who never once thought of themselves as Linux users. And that normalization matters more than the raw percentage suggests, because the moment something stops feeling like a technical experiment and starts feeling like a mainstream consumer product, the psychological barrier that kept people away collapses. A system people already associate with playing their favorite games on a couch becomes something they are suddenly willing to consider running on their actual desktop or laptop too. None of this means Windows has lost its grip on PC gaming, because it very clearly has not. Windows still commands over 92% of Steam's user base, and anti-cheat software used by many competitive multiplayer titles remains one of the last serious barriers keeping a portion of gamers locked to Microsoft's platform specifically. But the direction of travel is now undeniable, and directions like this rarely reverse once they gain enough momentum behind them. So you now have hardware manufacturers building and selling Linux machines as legitimate commercial products, rather than side experiments. You have hundreds of thousands of documented Windows defections tied directly to the support deadline, and you have gaming, the industry's most stubborn holdout, posting its strongest numbers ever recorded. And sitting right in the middle of all of this, Microsoft made a decision about its flagship Windows 11 feature that turned out to be one of the most controversial calls the company has made in years, one that even its own hardware partners eventually distanced themselves from in public. That story, and exactly what Dell said on a stage in front of the entire industry at CES 2026, is where we go next. Because to understand why Dell stood on a stage in front of the entire tech industry and said something no major Microsoft hardware partner had ever said publicly before, you need to understand what Microsoft was trying to sell consumers in the first place. The entire premise behind the newest generation of Windows laptops was built around artificial intelligence, specifically a dedicated chip inside the processor called an NPU, a neural processing unit, marketed as the reason you needed to replace your perfectly functional machine. The centerpiece feature built to justify that upgrade was something Microsoft called Recall, and on paper, the pitch sounded almost magical. Your computer would remember everything you had ever done on it. Instead of digging through folders or retracing your browser history trying to find something from last week, you could simply ask your machine what you were working on, and it would show you a complete, searchable timeline of your entire digital life. Microsoft framed this as nothing short of a new era of personal computing, not a minor feature update, but a fundamental reimagining of what a laptop could do for you. But then security researchers actually opened up the feature and looked at how it worked underneath, and what they found spread through the security community almost overnight. To build that perfect memory, Recall was capturing a screenshot of your entire screen every few seconds, continuously in the background, without you ever being asked in the moment. Every message, every email, every password visible on screen, every banking session, every private conversation, all of it quietly captured and stored in a database sitting directly on your device. In the earliest version researchers examined, that database was not properly secured, and one independent researcher demonstrated a tool capable of extracting the entire contents in under 2 minutes. No advanced hacking skills required, just basic access to the machine. Microsoft responded to the backlash the way most companies do when caught off guard, by making the feature opt-in rather than automatic, adding encryption, and introducing filters designed to keep sensitive information like banking pages out of the captured images. Those changes were real, and they mattered. But the fundamental architecture never actually changed. Your computer was still designed to photograph your screen constantly and organize your entire digital history into one searchable place, just with more security layers wrapped around the same core idea. And security layers reduce risk. They do not eliminate it, because encryption tied to a simple login PIN is still only as strong as that PIN, and malware sitting on a compromised machine does not need to break any encryption if it can simply read what appears on screen before Recall ever stores it. Beyond the technical vulnerabilities, something even more basic was happening. People did not want it, even secured, even entirely optional. The underlying awareness that a computer might be silently photographing every single thing you do created a discomfort that no amount of engineering reassurance could talk people out of. This is precisely the environment Dell walked into at CES 2026, one of the largest technology showcases on the planet, and what the company said there should have made front-page news everywhere it did not. Dell's head of product, Kevin Terwilliger, told press directly that the message delivered around the company's newest laptops was deliberately not AI first, a sharp reversal from the previous year when Dell had rebranded much of its lineup, specifically around artificial intelligence branding. He went further, stating plainly that consumers are simply not buying computers based on AI capabilities, and adding a line that spread through tech media almost instantly, that AI probably confuses people more than it actually helps them understand what a product does for them. Dell's vice chairman and president of the Client Solutions Group echoed the sentiment, and the company's own market research reportedly showed that buyers cared first about battery life, display quality, price, and a machine that simply feels fast the day you open it, not about theoretical AI capabilities buried inside a chip most people cannot even describe. This was not some small retailer making an offhand comment. This was one of Microsoft's most important hardware partners, a company that manufactures the physical machines Windows runs on, standing in front of investors, journalists, and competitors, and effectively admitting that the entire AI PC strategy the industry had spent 2 straight years marketing was not landing the way it was supposed to. Dell backed that admission up with action, quietly reviving its older XPS branding, stepping back from the aggressive AI-first messaging of the previous year, and shifting focus toward the fundamentals customers had been asking for the entire time. The market reaction was immediate and telling, with Dell's stock sliding more than 4% in the days following the announcement, as investors absorbed what it actually meant for a leading PC maker to admit the flagship strategy underpinning an entire generation of hardware releases was not resonating with real buyers. There's also a broader dimension to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Governments across Europe and Asia have been actively working to reduce their dependence on American software platforms for national infrastructure, with countries including Germany, France, South Korea, and India making documented moves toward open-source operating systems inside government departments and public institutions. Over the past 2 years, when institutions at that scale start pulling away from Windows, the effects ripple outward, pushing local developers to build more Linux-compatible tools and slowly dissolving the long-standing cultural assumption that Windows was ever the only serious option in the first place. Put all of that together, the licensing costs manufacturers are trying to escape. The Windows 10 deadline pushing hundreds of thousands of users toward alternatives, Linux gaming posting record numbers, and now one of the biggest names in the entire industry publicly admitting the AI PC narrative is not working. And a very different picture starts to form about where this is actually heading. In the final section, I want to bring all of these threads together and show you exactly what this means for the next few years. Because what looks like a series of disconnected headlines is actually one coordinated shift. And once you see the full pattern, you will understand why this moment is being compared to the biggest platform transitions in computing history. Because none of these signals mean anything in isolation, but stacked side by side, they form a pattern that is almost impossible to ignore once you actually step back and look at it as a whole. You have manufacturers openly weighing the economics of paying Microsoft a licensing fee on every single unit against building and selling Linux machines with no royalty attached at all, and some of them, including HP by its own internal trials, are already finding the math genuinely compelling. You have a hardware ecosystem that has matured to the point where Linux is no longer something you install as a side project on an old machine, but something you can buy factory fresh from Dell, Lenovo's, or Framework with full driver support, firmware, updates, and enterprise backing behind it. You have hundreds of thousands of documented defections tied directly to the Windows 10 support cliff, with roughly half of all PCs worldwide still sitting on that now unsupported operating system, as the final safety net prepares to close entirely in October of 2026. You have gaming, the single most stubborn reason people stayed loyal to Windows for decades, posting its strongest numbers in Linux's history, crossing 5% of Steam's user base for the first time ever and continuing to climb. And you have one of the largest PC manufacturers on the planet standing on a stage in front of the entire industry admitting that the artificial intelligence strategy meant to justify an entire generation of hardware upgrades simply is not resonating with the people actually buying these machines. None of this means Windows disappears next year or the year after that, or possibly for a very long time. Let's be completely honest about the scale of what we are talking about. The Windows ecosystem underpins enterprise software, corporate IT infrastructure, and legacies. Business systems worth billions upon billions of dollars globally, and that kind of entrenched infrastructure does not unwind in a single product cycle, no matter how many headlines get written about it. Microsoft is also pouring enormous resources into artificial intelligence through its cloud infrastructure and its partnership with OpenAI, and those bets may pay off handsomely in areas that have very little to do with what operating system sits on your personal laptop. But here is what history actually teaches us over and over again about dominant technology platforms. They almost never collapse suddenly. They erode gradually, quietly, one shifting incentive at a time, until one day people look back and realize the transition had already happened while they were still debating whether it was possible. Mainframe computers once seemed like a permanent fixture of the industry, until personal computers arrived and made that assumption look naive in hindsight. The personal computer itself once seemed like the only serious platform that mattered, until smartphones rewired how billions of people actually use technology every single day. Nobody sitting inside those transitions while they were happening predicted the speed at which they would unfold. They only ever looked inevitable after the fact, once the dust had settled and the new normal had already replaced the old one. Right now, heading through the back half of 2026, the signals coming out of the PC industry look remarkably similar to the earliest stages of exactly that kind of platform transition. Not a dramatic revolution happening overnight, but a slow, deliberate erosion in where the financial incentives point and what the default choice actually is when you open a new laptop for the first time. Manufacturers are discovering, through their own internal trials and their own sales, data that the default can genuinely change without destroying customer satisfaction. Users who were pushed off Windows 10 with nowhere clean to land are discovering that credible, well-supported alternatives already exist, and, in many cases, are working better than the machines they were told to abandon. Developers are increasingly building software that runs identically across every platform through the browser, quietly stripping away the operating system's importance as the thing that defines your computing experience. The operating system itself is slowly becoming infrastructure, invisible and interchangeable, rather than identity, the thing you build brand loyalty around. So here is the question I genuinely want you to sit with, because based on everything we have just walked through, it is no longer some abstract hypothetical. If you opened a brand new laptop tomorrow and it came preloaded with a fast, clean, ad-free Linux experience instead of Windows, and your browser worked exactly the way it always has, and every app you actually use every day was already right there waiting for you, would you even notice the difference? Would you even miss what used to be there? Drop your honest answer in the comments right now, because the biggest computer companies in the world are not asking this question as a thought experiment anymore. They are actively preparing for the answer, building the hardware, running the trials, and quietly repositioning an entire industry around it. If this video I actually gave you something new to think about. Do me a favor and hit that like button before you go, because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to see exactly this kind of story. The shift's happening underneath the surface of the tech world long before they ever become mainstream headlines. Subscribe if you have not already. Share this with anyone. You know who is still sitting on an old Windows 10 machine with absolutely no idea what has been happening around them. And I will see you in the next one.